Those familiar with the concept of masochism should be familiar with a certain minigame from Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator, that being Midnight Motorist. Those who have no life and intake way too much FNaF content may also be aware of the recently released demo for 5 Laps at Freddy's, also known as FNaF. FNaF? I like FNaF more. I fall under both of those categories, by the way. From what I gather about the game, it's pretty rough around the edges and needs a good bit of work, but the full game isn't scheduled to release until next year, so hopefully between now and then they fix whatever issues the game might have. Beyond that though, there was a certain revelation from 5 Laps at Freddy's that did get a lot of traction, and it's a minor detail that has to do with one of the cars in the game. A vehicle that, what do you know, is a purple car by the name of Midnight Motor. Why is this important? Because way back in FNaF 2, we saw that purple guy, aka William Afton, also drove a purple car. But that's not where the fun ends. Let me break it down for you. For starters, on the back of the car you can see a small yellow bunny head attached to the antenna. Honestly, I could leave it there. That's pretty direct confirmation as is. But I know some people have looked at this game and decided to disregard anything it might suggest. It is, after all, a spin-off racing game. However, I would like to draw attention to the tires of the purple car, more specifically the fender skirts that cover half the tires. Fender skirts, from what I gathered during my research, generally started to be in fashion during the 1930s. However, by 1985 they started to die out. As of this moment, the last car produced to have fender skirts was the 1999 to 2006 Honda Insight. However, again, from what I gathered during my research of these, there was this blip in 1989 to 1993 where fender skirts did make a brief return on Fleetwood Cadillacs. Now, why am I bringing car lore into this? Well, for starters, we can generally assume that Midnight Motorist most likely happens fairly early in the timeline, most likely the 80s. Now, of course, that's not really something people have necessarily been debating about. What's really interesting is the fact that the car in 5 Laps at Freddy's named Midnight Motor has these fender skirts. If you look back at the original Midnight Motorist minigame from FFPS, you'll also see that the car in the minigame also has fender skirts. It might be hard to tell at first glance, but when you compare the player's car to the other vehicles seen in the minigame, which you can find in the parking lot of Junior's, all the other cars clearly have black tires, while yellow guys are very clearly tinted. Now, it's been a subject of argument as to the color of yellow guy's vehicle. I would agree that this is very clearly not purple, certainly not the same purple seen in the Give Cake minigame from FNaF 2. Although, speaking of that minigame, let's take a look at the car Afton drives in that scene. Yep, you guessed it. The car Afton drives in that minigame also has fender skirts. It might be a little hard to see considering the simplistic style of the minigame, but if you really look closely, you can definitely see a darker shade of purple covering the upper half of the tires. Nowhere else in the series do we see cars with fender skirts. Only purple guys from FNaF 2, yellow guys from Midnight Motorist, and of course the purple car in 5 Laps at Freddy's. Personally, I think we could say without a shadow of a doubt that yellow guy is definitely William Afton, even though, yes, the change in the sprite's color is definitely an odd one. If I had to throw my 2 cents out as to why Scott made this choice, he might have not wanted people mixing up Michael and William again after the whole Will Trap and Mike Trap thing that happened after Sister Location's custom night. That might sound stupid, and I would be inclined to agree, but it also wouldn't be the first time people mistook Mike for his father, both in the series and outside it. Another possibility is that the yellow is supposed to represent William Afton wearing his disguise. Not the Spring Bonnie costume, mind you, but his public facade. The manipulative and deceitful facade that he used to lure and kill 5 children in 1985. Yellow is of course the color of Afton's favorite rabbit costume, and so the color choice here represents Afton putting that facade on. Basically it boils down to purple representing Afton when he's being outwardly evil and sinister, when he's being his true monstrous self. Meanwhile, yellow represents the mask he wears every day, the mask that allows him to deceive others. Whatever the reason may be, I think we can safely say that yes, Yellow Guy is William Afton. That, unfortunately, was the easy part of this topic. William Afton being Yellow Guy? Sure, alright, whatever. At the very least, it debunks stuff like Yellow Guy being the parent of an MCI victim, or, in the past, I've heard the theory that the runaway could have been Andrew from Fazbear's Frights. But like I said before, Yellow Guy is definitely William Afton. But, speaking of the runaway, that's where Midnight Motorist really does start getting a bit tricky. When it came to this aspect of the mystery, I really wanted to get other people's thoughts on the matter. That's why I made the decision to consult the FNaF Theory's Discord server yet again. If you've seen my Shadow Victim Theory video, you might recall that I mentioned them before. One of the things that's I'm gonna kill my One of the things that's important to me when it comes to theorizing is making sure I understand all sides of the debate, let's say. I think having communication with the community and understanding what other people think is not only helpful, but it also gives you different perspectives. Don't get the wrong idea, I'm not just gonna start spewing out regurgitated information, not entirely anyway. Some of this stuff is crap that we've all heard before, of course. But anywho, much like my previous Shadow Victim theory, I do intend to come to my own conclusion by the end of this video. But, like I said before, let's look at some other people's thoughts and opinions on Midnight Motorist. Take number 1. The animatronic footprints in belong to Shadow Freddy. This take was gifted to me by Scraps in the FNaF Theory's Discord server. Thank you to him for letting me talk about his opinion on Midnight Motorist. Scraps' opinion on is that Michael is the runaway and that the footprints seen outside the runaway's bedroom belong to Shadow Freddy. He thinks that Shadow Freddy leads Mike to where the recently deceased Charlotte Emily's body resides, that being the back alley where Afton left her. He brings up the fact that, in FFPS's intro, we see a dark version of Freddy that's reminiscent of Shadow Freddy. He also says that Lefty, which we know houses the puppet, bears a resemblance to Shadow Freddy. That might sound odd at first, but it's worthwhile to remember that in the Halloween DLC for FNaF 4, Nightmare On, the Nightmare version of the puppet, replaces Nightmare in that game. Scraps also mentions that, as far as we know, the Crying Child has never met Shadow Freddy, while Michael definitely has. I talked about it in length in my Shadow Victim theory, but for those who don't know, I'm pretty certain that Nightmare from FNaF 4 is Shadow Freddy. If you want to know why, check that video out. Don't worry, I'll still be here when you get back.
10 years later.
Anywho, Scraps points out that Michael has a knack for having the Freddy's brand follow him home, a la the alternate ending for Sister Location, where we see that the Eldritch entity known as Ennard has followed Mike home. FNaF 4 is also an example of this with the tagline, "What have you brought home?" Scraps' interpretation of Midnight Motorist is basically about Mike. Scraps says, and I quote, "I think the narrative of is a, not so properly told, way of expressing Mike's general story. He's attached to Freddy's and can't quite get away from it. He puts all of the blame of everything that happened on himself because of what he did to BV and the events that followed." Scraps believes that William killed Charlie as a test, so to speak. A test to see if someone really could live on after death in some form, which would then lead William to enact the nightmare experiment seen in Didophobia, which then leads to the creation of the Fun Times and then the MCI. It's also worth noting that this security puppet minigame where we see Charlie's death for a second time has a music track labeled Alchemist Fantasy, something that Scraps also points out in his post. But there's something else that Scraps says that I never really thought of, and it really stuck out to me. And that's the fact that, in the grand scheme of things, the Crying Child really doesn't have much to do with FFPS. I think there's definitely validity to that. When you think about it, each of the secret minigames in FFPS have to do with one of the characters that we see in the game. Fruity Maze depicts William Afton abducting Susie, the victim of the MCI that goes on to possess Chica. Chica, of course, is one of the animatronics that goes on to be broken down by Afton for his Fun Times. And we know the Fun Times eventually become Ennard, and we know Ennard becomes Molten Freddy. Then we have the security puppet minigame depicting Charlie's death again, which leads to her possessing the puppet, and we know via the secret blueprints in FFPS that Lefty was designed to capture and contain the puppet. That would mean Midnight Motorist is most likely about William Afton, who of course is Scraptrap. You could also say that it's about Michael as well if you believe he is the runaway, since we do play as him in FFPS. It's very much possible that the Crying Child was freed after FNaF 3 thanks to Happiest Day, and that FNaF 6 is more so just dedicated to the other characters still around by that point in the story. The black sheep of FNaF 6's cast would be Scrap Baby, since she doesn't get a minigame like the others do. However, she did just get her own game in the form of Sister Location, which also depicts Elizabeth Afton's death already, so all the context for that character was already explained. To sum up my final thoughts on Scraps' take on Midnight Motorist, I do personally lean towards Mike being the runaway, and I do think Michael feels a lot of guilt and regret over his brother's death, whether or not you think he died first or after Charlie. I would also agree that the Crying Child doesn't really have anything to do with FFPS considering the other minigames that we have. However, I'm personally not really sold on Shadow Freddy being the one that lured Michael. I know the theory exists that Shadow Freddy was possibly a byproduct of Charlie's agony when she died, but again, if you saw my Shadow Victim video, you might recall that I do believe that Shadow animatronics came from the MCI and DCI, specifically the agony surrounding those events. Compared to both of those incidents, I don't think Charlie's death was as impactful isn't the right word, but I don't think it was horrible enough to give way to Shadow Freddy. Now, granted, we're talking about child murder here, so it's difficult to weigh those tragedies, but I don't think Afton would have killed Charlie as a test. I think it was a kill of opportunity. Charlie's death has always been more of an entry level into the even darker and messed up things Afton will inevitably do. Just as Scraps says in his post, William Afton's first kill is sloppy and ill-planned. He most likely did it with his bare hands, and he wasn't even wearing his infamous yellow suit, and he did it right outside the building. If William wanted to do an experiment or test involving life after death, I think it would more directly have something to do with the Nightmare Chambers or even the MCI. Take number 2. The runaway isn't being lured. H1P0, yeah, I think that's right, just as Scraps did, believes that Michael Afton is the runaway. They bring up that the animatronic footprints don't lead or go anywhere. It's just a single set, inferring that, quite possibly, the animatronic in question leans more so into the supernatural side of things, more specifically, Golden Freddy. H1 also uses the movie as an example, pointing out that Golden Freddy goes directly to Mike and Abby's house to bring Abby back to the pizzeria. H1 deposits that the runaway's footprints aren't actually following the animatronics, but that they're running past the set of footprints instead. H1 believes that the animatronic Mike saw outside his window was Fredbear, and that when Mike breaks his window to go outside, Fredbear simply disappears, in the same vein that Golden Freddy normally does, I imagine. He also says he believes that the mystery dirt mound in MM could be the Crying Child's grave, and that's where Mike goes. I will say this, I do agree that I don't think the runaway is necessarily being lured by any means. I think it's more likely that, at the very least, something is asking the runaway to follow them, which, now that I think about it, does lend credence to the idea of the animatronic being Shadow Freddy, if you consider FNaF 3's Follow Me minigames. But, again, I don't think the runaway is being lured like the animatronics were in FNaF 3. On the topic of Golden Freddy, yeah, it does make sense that the animatronic that made these footprints would be a paranormal one. After all, it is only one set of footprints. Now, as for the dirt mound, I'll save that one for later. Take number 3, Follow Mare. I am surprised that so many people think that Shadow Freddy might have something to do with Midnight Motorist. Never my first thought, but the more I hear it, the more I can see where people are coming from. Haunt brings up some stuff that we've all heard of in the past. The fact that the minigame is labeled later that night in the game files, the fact that the rain in the minigame is the same as the rain in the security puppet minigame, and the fact that the card description for the Midnight Motor in 5 Laps at Freddy's reads as follows. Talk about a killer ride. This smooth cruiser is the perfect choice for anyone wanting to flee a crime scene. What's different from a lot of other takes though is that Haunt believes that Junior's is the location Charlie died at, and that Junior's is the same location that FFPS takes place. She claims that Junior's is its own location and that Fredbear's is a separate one. She also says that the reason Afton isn't allowed in Juniors is because there's a current investigation going on, that being Charlie's death. We know from Sister Location and the security logbook that Mike is an avid fan of the soap opera Immortal and the Restless, and so Haunt claims that the TV watcher in Midnight Motorist is Michael. That would mean that the crying child is the runaway. However, Haunt clarifies that she doesn't think he was lured away nor kidnapped. Now, this is where Haunt's interpretation gets a little interesting, so I think the best way to get it across would be if I just read it word for word. Mike says he had a rough day, so I think he already came back from Juniors upset over whatever he misunderstood in the shadows. I think this minigame is basically a gap between the nightmares and the minigames in FNaF 4. William's "he'll be sorry when he gets back" is there to explain why Mike becomes a dick and why William sets up the plush bear. I think Garrett was at Juniors, and when he came back home, he was followed by Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, Fredbear, and Shadow Freddy. Those are the animatronics who left the footprints in MM. That's who would have broken into the house. FNaF 4's description states explicitly that the terror has followed us home, highlighting all the nightmares. The title screen of FNaF 4 also perfectly matches with Midnight Motorist, animatronics in the bushes, lone house by the trees. I think that Midnight Motorist is the thing Garrett has nightmares about, and is what William based the nightmare chambers off of. It doesn't make sense to me for William to somehow 100% recreate the nightmares accurately. Mike also fits into this with him experiencing Garrett's nightmares, but I think by that point Garrett shattered into the animatronics. So when Mike dreams and feels closer to him like in the movie, his dreams are also infected with the MCI, since Garrett is attached to them. Now, that was a lot, and of course, I had some questions, particularly involving Shadow Freddy. Haunt clarified that she thinks the animatronics are somehow brought to life by Shadow Freddy, similar to how Eleanor brought objects to life in the books. Kind of what I said before when I was talking about Scraps' take. I don't think Shadow Freddy exists this early in the timeline. This is also a good chance to bring up the whole thing with Crying Child seeing something that he apparently misunderstands because he's a child, and I don't think that would have been Charlie's death. If you think the Crying Child did experience nightmares akin to that of FNaF 4, he doesn't have nightmares involving the puppet. Yes, Nightmarion is in the game, but Scott has went on record in the past saying that the Halloween DLC isn't canon. Also, the Fredbear plush in FNaF specifically says this: "Don't you remember what you saw?" when the Crying Child tries to go towards the stage. Then he also says this: "You know what will happen if he catches you." Whatever the Crying Child saw and is seemingly misunderstood, it has to do with Fredbear and the other animatronics because clearly he is terrified of them. Also, I don't think the Fredbear plush is William, and for the sake of saving time, I explained that in my previous theory as well. But I will say, I do agree with FNaF 4's title menu. That is actually quite interesting. I never realized how similar the house in Midnight Motorist looks to the one seen in FNaF 4's menu. I also want to say that I do see why people think Mike is the couch person. After all, the sprite is wearing a gray shirt and has gray text. But if we say that Mike is the TV person and that the Crying Child is the runaway, then that leaves the Dirt Mound without an answer. And I think that's the hardest part of this. The Dirt Mound has to be something, and its mere existence implies that something had to have happened prior to Charlie's death. I don't think it's Mrs. Afton. We know so little about her as is. We know that she had to logically exist because William had 3 children, but honestly there's more evidence to suggest she left William as opposed to dying. It can't be Elizabeth because Afton hasn't even started his nightmare experiments yet, and those took place in the underground bunker. It can't be Charlie. Her body was seemingly found. After all, Henry says this in FFPS's ending.
It's in your nature to protect the innocent. I'm sorry that on that day, the day you were shut out and left to die, no one was there to lift you up into their arms, the way you lifted others into yours. And then, what became of you?
But also, why would it be Crying Child's grave? My issue with the dirt mound being a grave at all is the fact that, number one, it doesn't look like much of a grave, and number two, why wouldn't Crying Child be buried in a normal cemetery? Now, I know that burials on private property exist. If you really want, you can bury a deceased family member on land that you own, but that's assuming this big ol' field in the forest somehow belongs to William Afton, which doesn't really make sense considering that the dirt mound is even further away from the Midnight Motorist house than Junior's is. So, where does that leave us? Well, it's time that I give my full take on Midnight Motorist. Take number 4. Elizabeth died first. Yeah, bear with me. I think we can all agree that the biggest issue with Midnight Motorist is this goddamn pile of dirt. The mere existence of this thing, like I said before, implies that something had to have happened before Charlie's murder. And we've already established that Midnight Motorist does take place later in the night after Afton killed Charlie. Although I might have implied otherwise earlier, it also does make the most sense for the couch person to be Michael. There's enough evidence there to suggest that efficiently. That would mean that the runaway is the Crying Child, and that the animatronic footprints outside were most likely a shadow animatronic. As for that dirt mound, the only logical option I could really narrow down to is it being Elizabeth's grave instead of the Crying Child's. I know this is going to sound really stupid, but I'm going to ask that you push aside the notions you might already have involving this minigame and just look at it mostly by itself. Yellow guy is William Afton. Alright, we've got that. He just recently killed Charlie. Okay, that's fine. Couch person is Michael. Sure, that makes sense. But what about the runaway? What about Junior's? When Yellow Guy goes outside and sees that the runaway has broken out of his room and runs off, he says that the runaway will be sorry when he gets back. He says that the runaway went to that place again. But what place? Well, I think that place was Junior's. It's the one place that Yellow Guy isn't allowed in, and we can clearly see that Afton isn't treating his son very well. I think it's very possible that, if Afton really was experimenting this early in the timeline, that he put the Crying Child into a nightmare chamber, whether it be for testing, or to make the Crying Child scared of the characters he enjoys. I know that I said before it doesn't really make sense for Charlie's death to be a test for Afton, and I still stand by that. But we have speculated for a long time that the Funtime animatronics might have come way earlier than we initially thought. And the fact that the Mimic and other recent characters might have possibly existed way earlier also supports this. Don't you remember what you saw? Well, the Crying Child might very well have seen Circus Baby kill his own sister. But also, why would Elizabeth be buried in the dirt mound? Well, unlike Crying Child's death, which was very public and witnessed, we know for a fact that Elizabeth's was more or less secretive. Circus Baby specifically waited until everyone was out of the room before she lured Elizabeth to her demise. Afterwards, we know William Afton hastily shut down Circus Baby's Pizza World, with their location only being open a single day, using the excuse of gas leaks to cover up what really happened. If that's the case, it's not out of the realm of possibility that William would have hid Elizabeth's body so that it wouldn't be found, whether it be so that he had easy access for experimenting, or simply so that nobody would ever know the truth. On the topic of Shadow Freddy being the animatronic outside the Crying Child's window, I know I already said I have issues with that, but it also does make some sense for this version of events because Golden Freddy isn't haunted by his spirit yet. We already established that it can't be an actual physical animatronic, so it has to be something supernatural. Shadow Freddy or Shadow Bonnie make the most sense. But here's where I really differ, because I don't think it was Shadow Freddy. I think it was Shadow Bonnie. Now, I really debated with myself on this one, but I can confidently say that these prints we see in Midnight Motorist don't really match Shadow Freddy's. Shadow Freddy's feet are a lot wider, and so are his toes. Meanwhile, Shadow Bonnie's feet fit a lot more with the shape of the footprints. I know I said before that I believe the Shadow animatronics came from the MCI and DCI, but solely focusing on Midnight Motorist, I think this makes the most sense. Most likely, Shadow Bonnie would have been derived from the agony surrounding Charlie's murder. To that end, it also makes sense that Shadow Bonnie would have led the Crying Child to where Charlie's body was. After all, why else would he be outside the Crying Child's window? Junior's could very well be a Freddy's location, maybe even one we've never seen before. Those who have read the Silver Eyes novel might recall that Junior's and Fredbear's bear a striking resemblance to each other, and that Fredbear's is also reminiscent of how your pizzeria starts off in FFPS. If I had to throw my 2 cents, I'd say Junior's was a smaller scale pizzeria, possibly even opened before the Freddy's that opened in 1983. That might sound odd, but it's not unheard of. Come to think of it, we actually might have seen it before. Remember those Freddy Fazbear and Friends cartoons that still were released before the launch of Security Breach? Well, in each cartoon, we see Freddy and the band performing in various places. In the first episode, they're in the forest, where they sing and dance in the wilderness instead of the confines of a pizzeria or diner. Then in the second episode, they're in a small building, definitely reminiscent of Junior's. And in the third episode, they're also in the same diner, but it seems to have gotten a slight makeover, as if it's been redecorated or even repurposed. But that's getting into a bit of a different discussion. More so, I just wanted to point out that it's more likely that Junior's is a Freddy's restaurant instead of a bar. It's still likely that Afton is drunk out of his mind in Midnight Motorist. Whether you think it makes sense or not, Yellow Guy exhibits characteristics of someone under the influence. His posture is one thing, but like I said before, his murder of Charlie is very sloppy compared to all of Afton's other kills. He comes home and the first thing he decides to do is start knocking on his son's door demanding that he open it, even after the couch person advised otherwise. Oh, and, he was also just speeding down the highway like a maniac. We might be talking about crazed serial killer William Afton, but he's definitely not in his right mind, or more accurately, he's at least not his usual insane self. Now, if we look at Midnight Motorist with all that in mind, yeah, I'd say it does make some more sense now. We've answered all the major questions, Yellow Guy's identity being Afton, the dirt mound being Elizabeth's grave, the runaway being the crying child, and the couch person being Michael. The minigame taking place later in the night after Afton killed Charlotte makes sense, and Shadow Bonnie being the animatronic outside the crying child's window fits well enough too. It all paints a complete picture that takes a little bit from a lot of other interpretations of Midnight Motorists. But no, it's not perfect. Saying Elizabeth died first implies what I already said, that the fun times came way earlier than we thought, before the MCI even happened. It also might imply that the crying child was Afton's first subject when it came to the fear experiments. But that's weird considering it makes more sense for the fear experiments to come after the crying child's death. Yet we know from the security logbook that the crying child did have dreams. Presumably dreams very similar to FNaF 4, or even exactly like those dreams. Now, don't get me wrong, you do still play as Michael in that game. It's just likely that Michael is experiencing what the crying child also went through. The theory has its issues, but I also think it's the theory where the pieces fit the best, and you aren't plugging as many leaking holes with chewed gum. But if I'm being honest, if I were to theoretically do my own take on a timeline for the series, I can't confidently say that this is what I'd go with. There's not enough evidence and logic behind Elizabeth dying first, not as much as there is for the crying child or Charlie. But if we're just looking at the minigame on its own, yeah, this all makes sense to me. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you to everyone in the FNaF Theory's Discord server who shared their takes on Midnight Motorist with me. I really appreciate it. Of course, thank you for watching. The title of this video is a question. Have we solved Midnight Motorist? And once again, if I'm being honest, no, the answer is no. We haven't. But thanks to 5 laps at Freddy's and some other surrounding information, we just know slightly more about it. Enough that we can definitely say that Yellow Guy is William Afton at the very least. Feel free to leave your thoughts, opinions, and death threats in the comments below. I always love reading what other people think about a theory, and my favorite part about theorizing has to be discussing theories with other fans of the franchise. But like I said before, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the flip side. Peace out.